Hello, ladies and gents. On the module DD316, political ideas. So I'm engaged in my last year of my academic integrity of arts and humanities. I'm on chapter 11. If you want to broaden your horizon, you have to be methodical in our approach, and we need to set a precedent. We need to cut off the social circle of friends that's stopping you get your. Everyone's got an idea, haven't they? Until they think about the idea, it becomes almost irrelevant outreach because you're not setting yourself a precedent. How can I get there? What do I need to do to be able to get there? Anyway, this is what I do methodically to keep my mind busy. Chapter 11, The Russian Revolution, the Role of Ideas. Areas as urban residents struggle to feed themselves, dramatically reducing the number of people available to work in factories. Although victories in the Civil War, the Bolshevik Communist Party, which from the 1918 was known as the All-Russian Communist Party, confronted a collapsing economy and significant social and political unrest. By 1920, productivity and industrial and agricultural output had fallen by between one-fifth and one-third of 1913 levels, Smith 2002. At the same time, mutinies had broken out against Communist Party rule in 1920 and 1921, alongside many local peasant uprisings. Tensions grew between peasants and bureaucrats as to the actual amount of food available, and this, alongside the impact of war and a drought, compounded the challenges of ensuring food security and contributed to the deaths of millions in famines in 1921. Recognizing that the privatization of war, communism could not be maintained, Lenin responded by introducing the new economic policy, the NEP. The NEP was a return to Lenin's idea of state capitalism. De Agostino, 2011. It was seen as a necessary, albeit long-term, step in the stabilisation of the state, and one that would further transition to socialism. White, 2001, McLennan, 1979. Lenin also saw it as an important way of pacifying the peasant opposition that had emerged during the war of communism. Fitzpatrick, 1982. As part of the NEP, small-scale private sector activity in both the industrial and service sectors was permitted, and peasants were encouraged to grow more food through the abolition of requisitioning and the potential to privately sell food above the specified amount. More 1965. Only large-scale industry, financial and transportation sectors were held in essential control. However, the NEP was a universally supported, seen as a potential threat to the revolution itself due to the reintroduction of capitalism. There was also hostility to the emergence of the NEP men, entrepreneurs who benefited from the NEP. Indeed, concern was expressed that without strong Soviets, NEP could come to mean the new exploitation of the proletariat. Priani, 2008. Although designed as part of the pathway to communism, the NEP would also bring further challenges to the relationship between the peasantry and the revolution. By seeking to pacify the peasantry, NEP had left them in a strategically important position. Mayor, 2000. Without excess agricultural production, there would not be the resource available to expand the industrial economy. Their willingness or not to produce that excess agricultural output would be critical to Russia's long-term development, and addressing it would be a feature of Stalin's Great Term. Stalin and totalitarianism. Prior to his death in 1924, during a long period of ill health, Lenin grew increasingly concerned at the concentration of power among a narrow party elite, and the way in which the party had become bloated and bureaucratic. Coupled with evidence and incompetence, Fitzpatrick, 1982, although originally an advocate of Stalin, ultimately by the end of 1922, Lenin expressed concern as to whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. Lenin, 1922a. His arguments for a significant reduction in the size of the state, and indeed his objections to Stalin as a leader, would, however, become unheeded. Lenin had underestimated Stalin's political maneuvering, which had enabled him to consolidate his power through the use of administrative practices to a political opposition. Fitzpatrick, 1982. Within a year of Lenin's death, Stalin had seized complete power. Exile, show trials, and assassination were important tools to eradicate opposition to his rule. All within society were subject to the whims of Stalin and the secret police who identified, imprisoned, or executed those seen as a threat to the state. Being a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU elite offered no protection. Former co-leaders with Stalin during Lenin's period of ill health, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenov were prosecuted and sentenced to death in 1936. Terror remained an important dimension of Stalin's power, and the apotheosis of its use come in what has been called Great Purge between 1937 and 1938, which left an estimated 1 million people dead. Socialism in one country and in the Great Turn. Whereas Lenin had foreseen a transition to socialism to be potentially protracted one, Stalin sought to re-articulate and hasten the evolutionary process. In December 1924, Stalin signalled a shift to socialism in one country, emphasising the consolidation of socialism in the USSR and the delinking the success of the socialist revolution from other proletarian revolutions. Instead, such success would rest on the USSR's own drive for socialism. Again, it would not be the consciousness of the proletariat that drove the revolution, but the fused parties subsequently Stalin's Great Turn was to signal distinct shift in economic policy away from the NEP to focus on rapid industrialization and collectivism, thereby creating the advanced economic state required for socialism. In effect, Lenin's idea that it was necessary for the first retreat to new economic policy in order to advance Lenin 1922b was being carried through by Stalin, who sought to organize a change and to launch a successful offense against the capitalist element. Stalin 1929, the original emphasis. Socialism in one country ran counter to much Marxist thought, including that the Marx and Engels, as well as Lenin and Trotsky. Engels had argued the communist revolution will not merely be a national phenomenon, but must take place simultaneously in all civilized countries. This is to say, at least in England, America, France, and Germany. Engels, 1847. This idea of revolution at the international level was important because it was the way in which proletarian revolutions could be sustained and supported against attack from other bourgeois powers. For Lenin and Trotsky, this did not mean that the revolution required coordination. Both accepted that there was the potential to initiate socialism in a single country. However, crucially, such a revolution would be complete until accompanied by world revolution. Ban-Ri, 1988. Trotsky had linked this point to his idea of permanent revolution and had argued that a proletarian revolution in Russia, given its uneven development, would survive only the external European support. Trotsky, 1919. He would subsequently criticize Stalin for both opposing permanent revolution through the idea of socialism in one country and for hampering the potential of revolution in a backward country. Trotsky's 1919. Stalin was seemingly a late convert to the idea of socialism in one country. In April 1924, Stalin had supported the idea that a revolution in one country remained an incomplete one. Although By 1924, he had shifted his approach. Stalin used his support for socialism in one country to criticize Trotsky, rejecting the idea that the victory of socialism in one country is impossible, claiming that it is an artificial, untenable theory. Stalin 1924. At the same time, Stalin venerated Lenin and sought to create a lineage between their ideas and their leadership by emphasizing the way in which the combined proletariat and peasantry had enabled the victory of socialism in one country, Stalin 1924, and specifically a country where capitalism was underdeveloped. Although there had been optimism that communist revolutions would occur elsewhere, following the Bolshevik seizure of power, this had proved to be misplaced. Rather than find itself with sympathetic neighbours, the USSR had confronted external support for opponents of the Bolshevik government during the Civil War. The Civil War had contributed to a fear of internal and external opposition and the threat it posed to the revolution and the party state. Socialism in one country also emphasized this fear by shifting the focus of the Soviet state away from supporting revolutions in other countries to defending the state by consolidating the revolution. Fitzpatrick, 1982. It perceived threats and the apparent need to ensure the USSR's economic self-reliance and readiness to counter any threats were to contribute Stalin's Great Turn and his adoption of a 5-year plan to radically reform and restructure the Soviet economy. In this way, socialism in one country became a tool by which totalitarianism became legitimized by subordinating the needs of individuals to the survival of the state, while also enabling a clear and optimistic framework in which to pursue economic goals. Stalin's Great Turn signalled a fundamental shift from the NEP to controlled and centralised economic planning. Rapid industrialisation through 5-year economic programmes was to drive Soviet economic development and increase the competitiveness. In order to support this industrialisation, agriculture would be collectivised. This would enable larger scale production with fewer people, providing a supply of labour to industry as people move from the countryside into cities. At the same time, the peasantry, with their ability to influence the outcomes of economic development through surplus production, would be subject to significantly greater control than they experienced under the NEP. The first 5-year plan was to produce ambitious economic improvements, with inflated and unattainable targets set, such as industrial productions up by some 250%. The human cost of such ambition was to be catastrophic. There was significant resistance to agricultural collectivism, including a large-scale slaughter of farm animals in order to avoid handing them over. Fitzpatrick, 1982. Stalin used the police and military to arrest, exile, or kill those who opposed the collectivism process. Those arrested were sent to work on large-scale infrastructure projects in other parts of Russia. May 2000. As a result of the forced collectivism process, agricultural production fell significantly, and the famine 1932-3 led to the deaths of some 4 to 6 million people. What emerged for Stalin's consolidation of the October Revolution was a large and highly centralised state, where the fusion of state and party, first during the Civil War, was institutionalised. Coercion and terror were used against both those within the CPSU and the citizenry as a whole to ensure the subordination of the individual to the needs of the state. The Second World War was to have a profound impact on the USSR, with millions dead and the subsequent extension of the USSR's power and influence into Eastern Europe. The state that Stalin had created would not last, however, and although it would not be until 1991 that the Soviet Union, instead, its state itself, would come to an end in the post-war period of the USSR, would confront significant challenges as an interesting economic and political weakness of the totalitarian regime become apparent. Chapter 11, Russian Revolution, Role and Ideas, page 240. After Stalin, Decline and Fall. Following Stalin's death in 1953, The Soviet state struggled to manage the Stalinist legacy, fearing the emergence of another Stalin, and with a recognition that constant terror was not a long-term viable option for the continued existence of the USSR. There was a limited acknowledgement of Stalin's repression. Khrushchev's 1956 denouncement of Stalin. Khrushchev 1956 was accompanied by the economic changes that sought to make the consumer goods more widely available and improve the provision of goods and services for people, including a home to be made available from each family and a more functional welfare state. Such changes did not, however, address the fact that the Soviet state remained both deeply hierarchical and clientistic, with informal systems of patronage important for both rising up the hierarchy and ensuring access to goods. The centralized structure of Lenin had argued was essential to the early survival of October 1917 revolution and to the transition to communism, and which had become embedded under Stalin, could not be dismantled. In this way, the structures that had enabled the CPSU to consolidate power were such that a party could not respond to the changes that were needed to remake the revolution in a way that addressed the problems identified. By the 1980s, the USSR was confronting multiple economic, political and social changes, and it was clear that the highly centralized system could not continue. Mikhail Gorbachev became leader in 1985 and adopted policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, literally restructuring, but used to refer to economic and political reform, as well as rejecting the high levels of militarization and isolation that had been a feature of USSR history. The economic reforms emphasized by Gorbachev were not designed to fundamentally change or replace socialism, rather the aim was to make it more effective, albeit with elements of market liberalization. At the same time, Gorbachev was confronting challenges across the USSR, with a changing political environment exacerbating long simmering ethnic and national tensions. Past leaders had used party purges, arrest and exile to limit the growth of nationalist sentiment. But that approach was not to open the Gorbachev Malia 1995, who instead favoured great decentralization as a way to address demands for increased autonomy and even independence. Gorbachev also introduced limited democratic reforms, leading to multiple candidate elections in 1989 to 1991. Boris Yeltsin, a former supporter of Gorbachev, had become a key opponent and had elected president of the Russian Republic in June 1991. As pressure grew on the Soviet state, political resistance to the reforms became increasingly apparent both within the CPSU and outside of it. The collapse of the communist rule across Eastern Europe, rejected declarations of independence from the Baltic states and the reunification of Germany, and the fear that, despite assurances to the contrary, NATO would place troops in the former East Germany. This all drove hostility to Gorbachev's reforms. In August 1991, hardline members of government and military who opposed the reforms and wanted to exert control launched a co-op attack against Gorbachev. Malia, 1995. Out of Moscow on holiday, Gorbachev was placed under house arrest, and it was Yeltsin who rallied public support to oppose the hardliners, who subsequently backed down. Although Gorbachev was to retain his position following a successful suppression of the attempted coup, his authority had been significantly weakened. Just as in 1917, when the Tsarist state had been unable to reassert control in the face of growing discontent, in the final months of 1991, the Soviet state also found itself unable to intervene in the processes that were leading to demise. The Baltic republics had the use of August Co-op to restore their independence, which was recognized by the USSR in September 1991, and the Ukrainian referendum in December 1991 overwhelmingly voted for independence. The once all-controlling state could not survive the internal and external pressures, and in December 1991, the CPSU suspended all activities in the USSR. The USSR was formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. It can be argued that constant fear of both internal and external threats and the accompanying monopoly of power that had been a feature of the early years of the Bolshevik government were essential to the decline of the USSR. The fusion of state and party that occurred during the Civil War was to have an important impact on the development of the consolidation of the revolution, while a monopoly power had initially enabled the Bolsheviks to introduce rapid and radical economic and social change. It also contributed to the atrophy of the regime, which led to the ultimate downfall.